Yasya Rashtre Praja Sarvas Trasyante Spadna Asadubhi Tasya Mattasya Nasyanti Kirti Ayur Bhago Gati. Translation: O chaste one, the king's good name, duration of life, and good rebirth vanish when all kinds of living beings are terrified by miscreants in his kingdom. It is certainly the prime duty of the king to subdue first the sufferings of those who suffer. Therefore, I must kill this most wretched man because he is violent against other living beings. Purport: when there is some disturbance caused by wild animals in a village or town, the police or others take action to kill them. Similarly, it's the duty of the government to kill at once all bad social elements such as thieves, dacoits, and murderers. The same punishment is also due to animal killers because the animals of the state are also the praja. Praja means one who has taken birth in the state, and this includes both men and animals. Any living being who takes birth in a state has the primary right to live under the protection of the king. Jungle animals are also subject to the king, and they also have a right to live. So what to speak of domestic animals like cows and bulls? Any living being, if he terrifies other living beings, is a most wretched subject, and the king should at once kill such a disturbing element. As the wild animal is killed when it creates disturbances, similarly any man who unnecessarily kills or terrifies the jungle animals or other animals must be punished at once. By the law of the Supreme Lord, all living beings, in whatever shape they may be, are the sons of the Lord, and no one has any right to kill any animal unless it is so ordered by the codes of natural law. The tiger can kill a lower animal for his subsistence, but a man cannot kill an animal for his subsistence. That is the law of God, who has created the law that a living being subsists by eating another living being. Thus, the vegetarians are also living by eating other living beings. Therefore, the law is that one should live only by eating specific living beings, as ordained by the law of God. The Upanishad directs that one should live by the direction of the Lord and not at one's sweet will. A man can subsist on varieties of grains, fruits, and milk ordained by God, and there's no need of animal food save and except in particular cases. The illusion king or executive head, even though sometimes advertised as a great philosopher and learned scholar, will allow slaughterhouses in the state without knowing that torturing poor animals clears the way to hell for such foolish kings or executive heads. The executive head must always be alert to the safety of the prajas, both men and animal, and inquire whether a particular living being is harassed at any place by another living being. The harassing living being must be at once caught and put to death, as shown by Maharaj Parikshit. The people's government, or government by the people, should not allow killing of innocent animals by the sweet will of foolish government men. They must know the codes of God as mentioned in the revealed scriptures. Maharaj Parikshit quotes here that according to the codes of God, the irresponsible man or state executive jeopardizes his good name, duration of life, power and strength, and ultimately his progressive march towards a better life and salvation after death. Such foolish men do not even believe in the existence of a next life. While commenting on this particular verse, we have in our presence the statement of a great modern politician who has recently died and left his will, which discloses his poor fund of knowledge of the codes of God mentioned by Maharaj Parikshit. The politician was so ignorant of the codes of God that he writes, "I do not believe in any such ceremonies, and to submit to them even at a moment as a matter of form would be hypocrisy and attempt to delude ourselves and others. I have no religious sentiment in the matter." Contrasting these statements of a great politician in the modern age with those of Maharaj Parikshit, we find a vast difference. Maharaj Parikshit was pious according to the scriptural codes, whereas the modern politician goes by his personal belief and sentiments. Any great man of the material world is, after all, a conditioned soul. He is bound by his hands and feet by the ropes of material nature. And still, the foolish conditioned soul thinks of himself as free to act by his whimsical sentiments. The conclusion is that people in the time of Maharaj Parikshit were happy, and the animals were given proper protection because the executive head was not whimsical or ignorant of God's law. Foolish, faithless creatures try to avoid the existence of the Lord and proclaim themselves secular at the cost of valuable human life. The human life is especially meant for knowing the science of God, but foolish creatures, especially in this age of Kali, instead of knowing God scientifically, make propaganda against religious belief as well as the existence of God, even though they are always bound by the laws of God, by the symptoms of birth, death, old age, and disease. Translation: O chaste one, the king's good name, duration of life, and good rebirth vanish when all kinds of living beings are terrified by miscreants in his kingdom. It is certainly the prime duty of the king to subdue first the sufferings of those who suffer. Therefore I must kill this most wretched man because he is violent against other living beings. Here Maharaj Parikshit expresses the duty of the king to prevent violence. Violence, of course, usually implies violence against living beings. And this also implies then that we recognize the value of living. And that in other words, we distinguish life from non-life, that is, chit from achit, conscious entity from unconscious things. So we understand there's some principle of life that has to be respected. Unfortunately, in the modern world, though people do recognize animal life versus rocks and things like that, many of them believe that life itself is a product of matter. So it's actually not much different from matter. On the other hand, we find that the Vedic literature makes a very clear distinction between living beings and dead matter. There is a difference, and it's not just moving around and things like that. It means that there is a jiva, or an atma, within the body, who is the living being. So that is recognized by the Vedic literature. Rocks and other things, they don't have a living being enlivening the rock or as a body, etc. So the Vedic literature recognizes the existence of the soul or the jiva, and furthermore recognizes the fact that jivas come in various types of bodies. So we have plant bodies, animal bodies, human bodies, and deva bodies, and Brahma's body, etc. In other words, life is not restricted to the human being. If we respect life, then we have to respect all life, from the lowest living entity up to the highest living entity. That is respect for life. Why? Because of the jiva. And we're not so much interested in the body but we're interested in respecting the jiva within the body. To get to that level requires advancement. One has to understand the difference between soul and body, and that is also a little rare for the human being. So if one can do that, however, then we can make good progress. Of course, we also understand that if the government is properly, and then people get educated properly, and then they understand they're not the body of the soul, because they understand the scripture, simple the principle of scripture. In other words, religion is not all bad. It's not completely separate from politics or government. We cannot separate the two things, because we have to have a good definition of life in order to run the government. If the government can define what is life, and they just think it's human bodies but not animal bodies or plants, then it's not going to work. And if they think that the human body, there's different types of human bodies, so we can respect this one but not that one, just because of color or race or whatever, again, is not going to be practical. So, the scriptural understanding is quite valuable for a government. And therefore, in the purport, Prabhupada talks about the atheistic leaders who have no belief in God or in the soul, only matter. So then, what can they do with the government? How can they govern people if they think that people don't have souls? It's all matter. What is the whole point? So we do have to have some connection between an efficient, a really efficient government and religion. Of course, we don't talk religion in the sectarian sense, but let's say spiritual sense, that there should be some spirituality there. Unfortunately, historically speaking, as Kali Yuga has progressed, even the spiritual or religious life and the theology and philosophy or whatever has become somewhat stunted. And when we talk about religion, it becomes something quite different from the actual understanding of soul and body or God and material energy, etc. It becomes something quite different. So, therefore, many people have a prejudice against religion. Though the foundation of religions is sound, that as they understand God and spirit and matter, etc., by the influence of time, the superficial aspects have been emphasized over the fundamental theological basis, or the belief. In other words, there's less understanding of difference between body and soul and God and material energy, and more emphasis upon the outward external nature of religion. That is, who we call God, how we worship that God, whether we bow down or we do arti or we pray in the church or we sing hymns or whatever. Or the language itself may be different in Sanskrit or Islamic language or Latin or English or whatever. So if we concentrate on the external aspect rather than the internal aspect, then we're bound to get a problem. In other words, we end up with what we call sectarianism. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes a lot about that in preaching to the modern people in his day, which was over 100 years ago now, 150 years ago maybe. He wanted to avoid this type of superficial understanding of religion. So he calls too much attachment to these externals to be sectarianism. And that we define true religion according to the external aspects of it. And that will be different from another religion, etc. So when we do that, we get what we call sectarianism or sampradaic prejudice. So this person is good because he has these marks and he dresses like this and he speaks this language and he accepts the scripture, and he's bad if he doesn't accept it. So that's what we call sectarianism. So he says, though the foundational beliefs are very good, when we get too attached to the externals, then we end up with a lot of problems. So he defines the two types of people. The Bharavahi means the bearer of a load, like a donkey bears the heavy load on his back like this. So the people who are interested in material advancement and they take religion as some superficial external customs or whatever, these are called the bearers of heavy loads because they simply exhaust themselves by doing this. They don't get any spiritual advancement. On the other hand, the people that really understand the nature of soul and God and material energy, etc., and understand that the whole principle is to get love of God, those people are called the Saragrahis, those who accept the essence. Like the swan. So the swan is able to separate when milk and water are mixed together. Then the swan can pull out the milk and leave the water. Somehow the swan can do that. So the gather, or another example given in the Bhagavatam, is the bee. The bee goes to all the different flowers and then takes out a little bit of essence, the sap from the flower, and then it makes honey. So it takes the essence out of all of the flowers. So the true spiritualist or religious person is the one who can take the essence. Now, he's not so much concentrating on externals, but on the aspect of relationship of jiva to God as prema, and understands that's the essence of everything. And everything else supports that. So he's called the Saragrahi. Says, these are the actual devotees. These are the actual spiritual people or religious people. And if we have such people, no matter what the group is, or sampradaya, or sect, or whatever, if they can understand that, then there's a common ground for advancement. And if they don't, then we end up with all sorts of fighting. So, in the modern world, due to scientific advancement, rationalism, etc., people have begun to criticize religions because of the sectarian nature of things, how they divide people up, etc., and can be a cause of war, etc. So rather than have sects, they say, okay, let's just forget about religion completely because we're rational also, and whatever. So then they discard everything. And in doing so, they actually dig their own graves. Certainly there's a point if they are criticizing the Bharavahis, those that are just completely into rituals and things like that, and they don't really understand the difference between matter and spirit, and that the goal is love of God. If they don't understand, fine, they're not very spiritual at all. But to say that everything is wrong, and to reject the actual concept of Supreme Lord and Jiva, etc., then they're losing everything. The whole goal of life becomes lost. It's simply materialism, which will lead to ultimate dissatisfaction. So we do have to balance things out. So Prabhupada here in the purport mentions a great politician of the modern age. I don't know who that is, but I would assume it's Nehru. I don't know. Is it Nehru? Anybody know that? So he was a modernist, unlike Gandhi. He wanted to, Gandhi wanted to have spinning wheels everywhere and go to the villages, have an agrarian society and not so much industrialization. Nehru was the opposite. He wanted to modernize everything. So I suppose he's the one they're talking about here as the great politician who was atheistic. didn't care for religious ceremonies. So when he died, it doesn't really matter what you do. I don't care in these religious ceremonies. So when we separate the government completely from the correct religious belief or spirituality, then we're bound to get problems. And we see that around the world. People can become very dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied because some people have more and some people have less of material things. That's one dissatisfaction. And the other is that ultimately, even if they get everything material, they're still dissatisfied and they don't know what to do. So therefore, we do have to have a different type of politics and government, and it's a consciousness in general, so that the governors or the people who are governing can be very wise and fulfill everybody's material needs, which is mentioned here, no violence. So we, of course, animals and plants, and then the human beings even, we have to minimize the violence there. We have to create a harmonious system by which everyone gets their due share of things. And connected to that, it's not just the material aspect that is involved. It's good, okay, have no violence in society, but how are we going to maintain that even? Unless it's connected with a higher goal. The higher goal isn't there. There's bound to be dissension and ultimately violence and conflict, etc. It cannot be helped. So that is why the two systems must go together, the religious system and the political system. There has to be a connection somewhere. Otherwise, we'll end up with frustrated people on one level, and again, a very troubled world, because here, as Prabhupada's pointing out, you have to respect the animals also. And then, of course, you can say the plants also. And the earth itself, which isn't even living. We have to give respect to everything. The cow actually is, of course, the cow with animals in general, and the bull. But then the cow is also the earth. The principle of the earth. That is the rocks and the rivers and the trees and the air and the sunlight and whatever. That's also earth, part of the earth. So earth is getting attacked by Kali also here. So everything falls into disarray or disharmony because of lack of respect. And the only way one can respect properly is two. One, understand the difference between jiva and matter. The other is that jiva is very important. The other is to think that even the matter and the jiva are under the law of the Lord. And we have to know what that law is. So if we don't have that understanding, then there's going to be all sorts of discrepancies on this earth. Okay, any question?
So, if we have a government based on religious principles, the moral and ethical codes are sort of embedded within that religious sort of guidelines, but a sectarian state, on what basis is the moral and ethical guidelines based? Is it simply whatever?
What do they make their laws on? What's the basis of the law? You have to ask a lawyer, I guess, or a politician, but I would assume originally there is some connection, because the laws were derived maybe from the religious codes. Do not kill, do not lie, don't steal your neighbor's wife, the Ten Commandments. So there's some connection in the Christian thing. Other countries, I don't know what they base it on. They probably just borrow the same things from another country. They base their constitution on the other constitution of another country, etc., like this. So America, a lot of theirs was influenced by the, of course, based on the English tradition. But then they wanted to be very, let's say, democratic and equal, so everybody has equal rights, etc. They emphasize that an awful lot. in their constitution. So it's probably originally influenced by morality itself, which comes from religion, but then eventually they kind of separate themselves from the religious aspect. Of course, America is still related to God in one sense. In God we trust or something is there? In the bill, the dollar bill maybe, I don't know. So, there is a connection somewhere, but it's a little bit distant now. And most countries, they separate the church and the state. Most of them do. I think Germany doesn't. Germany has, they sponsor the church, one church. I think the Lutheran church they support. And of course Islamic countries, they're very connected with the religion as such. Other countries, they kind of separate themselves.
I guess communism, I guess they, like Russia, etc., they had roots in the Russian Orthodox Church. So I guess overlap with that.
Well, often there is an overlap of like the religious head and the spiritual head, like in England. I think it was Henry VIII wanted to make himself the head of the church also, or he separated. He didn't like that church, so he made his own church. So, but this is all on the material level. They're dividing things up for political reasons. Or Constantine, he became a Christian emperor, whatever, for political reasons like this. So this is where the spirituality of the religion starts getting decreased, and let's say the superficial aspects increase for political reasons or something like that. And then it becomes very dangerous because we start to lose the real essence of religion there, the spiritual aspect of it, and it goes on to a lower level. Which is why they try to separate it now, because they found out that was, we have religious wars, this king against that king based on religion. It was not religion at all, it was just sectarianism.
There are a lot of people, they say religion just causes war.
Yeah, Marx is like that, I think. Religion is opium to the people, it just blinds them and like that. So on a lower level, that's what it does. So that's why we also condemn something like, karma kanda. They get stuck in their rituals, and smartas are stuck in their rituals, etc., because they don't understand the highest goal.
It seems it's a very artificial, like communism, for instance. One of the Eastern Bloc countries, when communism was lifted, and the first thing they started to do was put up Christmas trees. So that innate need for religion's there. They
suppress it for so long, and then as soon as the communists think, it comes back again. And now in Russia, the church is very strong. In fact, the government itself is next to the church, and they're kind of in cahoots. They're working together. And so it's a natural satisfaction that people get from something spiritual, but if it's becomes too superficial, then again it's not satisfying. And then that's why people will reject it. As we see in America, not many people go to the church, or even here in Australia, I think not many people go to the church.
Thank you, Mike. You just made a comment then about how on lower level religions, based on Bhanu comment that religion causes war or something. Yet we see the fundamental activity of the Bhagavad Gita is a war. So people could also
Well, that war was not based on religion. That was based upon family and then dharma. Who's the rightful heir to the throne? So that wasn't a religious war as such, like two different religions fighting, or Shaivites against Vaishnavas. It wasn't that type of war. It was a war based upon the principle of who is the qualified leader, ultimately. So that was a different type of war. Oh, of course, now the idea is that violence here is talking about violence and how we have to suppress violence. But then, there are cases where violence is necessary, again. And that's also presented in Bhagavad Gita. The Kshatriya cannot be afraid of violence, but it has to be applied properly, in the proper place. So if there is a challenge to the kingdom and to dharma in the kingdom, then he'll have to use violence to defend. Or just like Prabhupada says, a tiger, okay, he can go out and kill his animal. That's nature. So for the human being, that principle is also there on one level. You shall not kill, no violence. That's one principle of going back to the Vedas. And the other principle is that if somebody attacks you, you have a right to be violent. You can defend yourself. If they set fire to your house, they steal your wife and children, then you have a right to be violent. You can defend yourself. It's not that you're just pacifist and such. So there are cases where violence is there also. It's a trick, of course, to see just when to use the violence and not to use the violence, because then you can use that excuse to have a holy war. And God tells us to have a war, so we'll have a war. Like this. You can exploit the one reason for having a war. So we have to be very careful also when we use the violence that is actually scripturally authorized and there's good reason for it. Otherwise, it could be it's for economic reasons or other sectarian reasons or whatever, racial reasons or whatever, maybe so many different reasons. Something quite different from what the leader was talking about, maybe also.
Yeah, quite different for different purposes. And I'm wondering, it's an interesting phenomenon how they become so powerful. It's like a snowball effect. Like Christianity goes all over the whole world, and it's based on these principles that were created by these people who came after the personality.
Yeah. Well, one, of course, is political things. There were political things there to spread it as well. So they use the religion for politics in many places as well. It's very true that like Buddha, what he was preaching is quite different from the Buddhism now. Well, we have these huge temples and this and Buddha statues. He didn't talk anything about Buddha statues and huge temples. Probably didn't have a temple even in Buddha's time. Very, very simple. The Christian church, Christ also, but then we get St. Peter's. It's a huge monument like that. They took so much wealth to build that over hundreds and hundreds of years. But Christ probably would be very surprised. This is where his religion went into that. As time goes on, then they may do things, some of which may be contrary actually to the very principles that were established by the founder. So that's another problem, that things get distorted as time goes on, and they emphasize different things. And of course we see that's why even in the Christian church, some groups, they start getting a little restless, so they have to start a new order. They say, this is not what we're supposed to do. We have to go more simple and meditate and pray more. So they start their Benedictines or whatever, different Trappist monks or whatever like that, because they think the rest of the church isn't going in the right direction. We see the same thing in Buddhism. There's groups like in Thailand. They say, this is all useless. Let's become vegetarians again and meditate more. There's this constant tension between, you innovate so much and then you may lose some of the principles in the process. So you have to understand that's why as I said, the saragrahi is very important, the person who can grasp the essence and understand that. At the same time, there are certain things in terms of dress and habits and actions and ceremonies and ritual, which are no problem with them, as long as you don't get too much into that and you don't see the real essence. And the other way is to go the opposite, just take everything away, no more rituals, nothing, and go back to a very simple thing. I think that's what the Unitarians do, isn't it? There's no ritual or anything in the Unitarian church. It's just like completely, there's no prayer time, there's no singing, there's nothing. So they went to an extreme to get rid of the externals and just concentrate on the relationship with God. Or Christ, I guess, in the Christian church.
So found that we've seen with the Govardhana, even during Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's time, he made that comment when he built the big temple. He said he was fighting over roots. We also see during Srila Prabhupada's time that when he at one point in the early 70s, I think, was just like in disgust, he left Los Angeles because his disciples started to claim actually they misunderstood Prabhupada was actually. So, so even in like any authorized religion, we see that this tendency is there.
Yeah.
What is the tendency? Why do we do these sort of things? And how to avoid it? What's the practical means where we can ensure that we avoid it? And of course, you mentioned the point about the Sarvati, the person who's knowing the essence.
Yeah.
But how do those people?
Yeah, so that's what we have to concentrate on, maybe. And the other thing, of course, is why the changes come in. Some of it may be because of materialism, whatever. They have their own personal ambitions or whatever, so they want to change something so they get more power or whatever like that. That often happens, within the groups and stuff. They change things so they can get their way or whatever like that. Material desires, desire to live comfortably. It can all interfere with the main purpose of the Acharya.
But then, where obviously there needs to be checks and balances with these things, but where are the checks and balances? Like when the Acharya is present, we see that even there was deviation then.
Yeah.
And he adjusted it.
Yeah. So then it's up to the successor after he disappears. When he's there, no problem. He can adjust, and he can change if he doesn't like and say this is wrong, whatever. What happens afterwards, then the next authority, whoever that authority is, usually it goes to one person. And then they have to decide, So I think in the Catholic Church it ended up with the Pope. He was the final authority, and then his council under him, they would decide everything. In the case of Gaudiya Math, they were supposed to make a GBC, but then that broke up. In the case of ISKCON, the Prabhupada said, okay, you have to establish the GBC. So that was you'd say, the way of continuing the main principles, preserving the main principles without distortion. And of course, then the problem with this everything is that times change, societies change. Everything changes, and it's more critical now in the modern world than it was like from 5000 BC till 1000 BC, 1500 BC. Not much change in one sense, because main transport was walking and bullock cart, maybe, and a horse. 5,000 years ago, unlike that, not much change. Communications, maybe they started to write letters, and somebody would carry the letter on horseback. But then with the Renaissance, and then the scientific revolution, and industrial age, and modern scientific invention, within a few hundred years, everything changed. And this is also how religion got sacrificed. Science won over religion in the whole process there also. And plus we end up with all sorts of, and then society, because all these changes are taking place in the scientific world, within communications changes, transport changes, then society begins to change completely from what it was. Very, very quickly everything changes. So that in the modern world, it's like, what is culture? And the countries lose their identity because of all the information from all around the world coming in nowadays. So society is changing, language is changing, everything's changing very, very quickly, and every 3 years or so it's probably changing nowadays. So how do you adapt? How does a group adapt to that? So you have to do something to communicate with people if you want to. Of course, you can stay separate, like the Amish. You just stay separate. They don't want to communicate. But if you're trying to preach and communicate with the public at large, then you have to do something. You have to, alter something there as time goes on. But what to alter and what not to alter, that's the whole problem. So how to keep the main principles and the star, the essence there, and at the same time be a little practical to catch the people in the modern world. And that's the whole problem, I think. And at the same time maintain the purity so that the essence remains, and we don't get, start changing that also and come into a material, get influenced socially by the material goals, Okay, Hare Krishna.